Let's talk about Aristotle and do a little bit of background on him. And so, if you just pick up Aristotle and you start reading, then you may not really fully appreciate, I don't see how you possibly could, the massive influence that he has had. And so knowing especially that, he was Plato's student, he studied at the academy, he was with Plato for some 20 years. So it's like, okay, so he's kind of playing second fiddle to Plato. He was supposedly going to be, the chosen one who would succeed Plato in the academy. Didn't really work that way because Aristotle was from Stagira instead of from Athens. And so he went off and started his own school, the Lyceum. So there's that. But Aristotle's influence is really hard to overstate because there is a certain sense in which many disciplines got their start with Aristotle. So a structured study of biology, of rhetoric, of logic, and so on and so on. The treatise style that we are accustomed to, hearing so much about and that we still write in today harkens to Aristotle. And so he is at the, fountainhead of a lot of these things. And his influence extended for an extraordinarily long time. I mean, we're talking about 1,500 years plus of hegemony with respect to the way in which his thought structured and set the agenda for the, inquiry into a variety of things. And indeed, Aristotle's physics. So this is Aristotle's physics. As late as, 1400, 1500, people were still trying to overcome Aristotle and Aristotle's physics, even with its notable shortcomings. And this is a really, really long time after Aristotle had written. I mean, picture somebody today who's writing, thinking, is my work going to be used and referred to 1800 years from now? I mean, come on. It would be lucky in many cases if it's used 10 years from now or 100 years from now. That's amazing. 1800 years is almost unthinkable. And so his influence is truly, truly massive. Now, in the medieval universities, and I think this is also a testament to this sort of thing. So in 1210, one couldn't really study Aristotle. By 1270, with the work of Thomas Aquinas, Aristotle was required reading. And indeed, beyond that time, you had people calling Aristotle the philosopher. And so you didn't even have to refer to him by name. All you had to do was say, the philosopher, and everybody knew that you were talking about Aristotle. That's how massive his influence was. That's how significant a figure he was in Christian theology, in the Christian universities, in Europe, many, many years later. And so that is, I think, truly significant and interesting. So, okay, with that being said, let's back up a little bit and talk about Aristotle the person. So Aristotle, we are told, and I think this is kind of an interesting story, is that he was noticed for his kind of fussy attention to his clothes in Plato's academy and fashion, and that he cultivated a lisp so as to sound like the aristocracy. And that's something I think it's this little foible, that it's for us to imagine, especially for somebody who went on to become such a profoundly influential figure, is kind of funny. And we hear at one point that Plato said that the academy consisted of the body of students and the mind of Aristotle, which is probably not too terribly hard to imagine, right? You have Athens, which is, by all respects, it was a large town in the ancient world, but I mean, nothing compared to today. You have these two guys who are right next to each other, who work with each other for a very long time, and really become the kind of, twin pillars of philosophy. So it's not hard to imagine that Aristotle would have been recognized in his time. So, okay, that being said, now, in 342 BC, Aristotle was invited to teach King Philip's son, Alexander. Alexander would, of course, go on to become Alexander the Great, who went on conquering the known world and at a certain point stopped, and turned back. And, really had extraordinary success. And Aristotle traveled with him for some time, collecting specimens and tutoring Alexander. And so, again, even in his own lifetime then, he was influential. Now, I mentioned that Aristotle went on to start his own school, so kind of on the other side of town from Plato's academy, called the Lyceum. And his students were called Peripatetics. And peripatetic, the word peripatetic means to walk around. And this gives us a kind of, graphic feel for what it is that Aristotle did, so what the teaching style was like, where they would walk around and discuss ideas and talk philosophy. So even still today, when we say that someone is an Aristotelian, we can also equally well say that they are a peripatetic, referring to this same sort of tradition. Now, we're also told that Athens tried to bring Aristotle up on charges of impiety as well. In following with what happened to Socrates, he famously quipped that he wouldn't allow Athens to sin twice against philosophy, and took his leave. Now, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting, and especially very different, in that there's such a contrast between Plato and Aristotle in their writing styles. And we're told that Aristotle wrote dialogues. Unfortunately, we don't have any of them. There are a lot of works of Aristotle that tragically we just don't have. And while that situation isn't great, it was much worse in the medieval universities. For the longest time, the only thing that we had from Aristotle was the organon. In other words, his instrument, which was his logical works. And so we didn't have a lot of the other stuff that now today we look to and say, okay, these are the ones that we want everybody to read first. We don't often start with, the categories or the posterior analytics or something of the kind. And so that is another thing that is I think kind of interesting. But with his writing style, so Aristotle wrote in treatise form, which sounds very familiar to our ears. And one of the reasons that I don't like to start with Aristotle in an introductory philosophy class, and I like to start with Plato instead, is because Aristotle is almost too familiar. The treatises still look like the same kind of books and essays that we get from philosophers now, and it's almost too familiar. So there's the thought that perhaps, these aren't even, writings by Aristotle himself. Maybe they were the lecture notes of his students that they took down, compiled, collated, and dealt with from there. I doubt it. That's always been my hunch, and that's always been my suspicion with this, because the works are dense. They are well organized, and if we hang on every word and we, take... So this is the way that I approach ancient philosophy especially. So with Plato and Aristotle both, every word is very important because every word was precious. It wasn't that easy for them to write something down and have it, kept from generation to generation. And so because every word is so important, then I think it behooves us to consider that all that much more, that these aren't just throwaway words. It's not like we're writing an email today where, you just kind of hammer out something quickly on your phone or keyboard or whatever, and then you hit send and you don't think about it. It doesn't matter. It costs you basically nothing. That was not the case in the ancient world. Each word was very important. And so if you were going to go to the trouble of doing this and then for it to be copied, each word had better be chosen just so. And that's oftentimes what we find with these works, both from Plato and then also arguably from Aristotle. And because we find that premium on each word being selected just so, and offering significant philosophical density on their own, then I think we have reason for believing that these were not just the lecture notes of his students. Now, that being said, the treatise style still is markedly different than what we get especially from Plato. And so with Plato, we have dialogues, and the dialogues are philosophic conversations. And so as you may recall, Socrates didn't write anything, and said a great deal about how it was that conversation was the way that philosophy should be. And in fact, maybe that's the only way that philosophy should be, and that it shouldn't be written down at all, that it loses something essential to its character. And we might say that Plato was trying to do the best that he could in capturing that conversation in dialogue form, because the dialogues are just written conversations. And they are written conversations that involve the reader and draw the reader into the dramatic setting and invite the reader to be a part of understanding, interpreting, and going through the ideas so as to give birth to their own philosophical insights. I mean, that's very much the story of Socratic dialectic and philosophical midwifery. Aristotle, however, writes in treatise form, which seems much more similar to what it is that we have today, in the sense that he's following through and oftentimes articulating a well-structured logical argument. Now, Aristotle, in some sense, discovered, invented syllogistic reasoning, certainly codified it. And so he drew together all of these different arguments. And I heard a brilliant exposition of this recently where someone was saying that it was kind of like what we see now with computers and machine learning and AI, where they're trying to abstract away general principles from seeing this, massive training set of experiences or whatever it might happen to be. And that Aristotle was doing the same thing in the sense that he saw all of these arguments, all of these conversations, all of these ways of thinking and speaking and doing philosophy, and abstracted out the logical principles. And the abstracted out logical principles and rules were the structure that he put together in his logic, in syllogisms. And so a syllogism is nothing more than, this is frequently the one that people start with in intro to logic classes, right? So, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Now, that kind of argument is true not because of Socrates and, what it means to be human and what it means to be mortal. It's true because of the structure of the argument, such that if we know that the premises are true, then the conclusion necessarily follows because of the structure of the argument and the way in which they're combining the concepts together. And so we have this kind of quasi-mathematical relation between the concepts, between the ideas, and such that the structure of the language actually yields additional truths that can be derived. And so this traces back to Aristotle. This is a subject of study in its own right. I teach logic. It's in philosophy departments, and so it's something that still goes on today, and that has its origin in Aristotle. But it's not clear, with this being said, it's not clear that the treatise style hasn't lost something essential. And I can't help but to think that Plato would have thought that the treatise style lost something essential. Because, he didn't do it. This was not the way that he wrote. Now, you might argue that once we get towards the end with, the Laws and the Statesman and whatnot, we have these kind of extended monologues where Socrates is speaking, nobody else is really speaking, and when his interlocutors do say something, they don't say very much. So it's kind of like a treatise. But with Aristotle, all pretense of drama is done away with. You don't have the setting, you just have the ideas in some kind of, very logical and essay-like exposition in the way that we are comfortable with and are familiar with. But is that the way to do philosophy? It seems pretty clear that Socrates didn't think so. It also seems pretty clear that Plato didn't think so. And Aristotle didn't start that way, of course, because he was a student in the academy for a long time. But is this, what are we to make of this transition? Why is it that we have a transition from the dialogue and conversational, living and breathing interaction and all of the rich communication that goes on when people actually have philosophical conversations? That morphs into something written, where Plato is doing a kind of, all-star version of different conversations and, putting pieces together, and here are the dialogues that give us, certain exemplars for philosophy. The next stage that happens, and this happens a generation later. Plato and Aristotle spent decades together, which is amazing because they are so different with respect to this. So within a single generation, we have a movement from the dialogue style to treatise writing. Why? Why did this happen? It's still kind of an open question, but philosophy is at the very least shifting, and what it is that we think about how it is that knowledge can be transmitted, how it is that things can be taught, what it means to do philosophy, all of that is undergoing a kind of shift. And that's why, again, I don't like to begin with Aristotle because it's obvious, but these are essays, it's just like anything else that we might read in a magazine or a philosophy journal or book or whatnot. But what's lost there is just how staggeringly different that is from what came before, and what came before with his teacher that he was with for 2 decades. So that's something I think that needs to be brought out.